Genesis chapter 23 begins like this, and we'll read the whole chapter, and then I'll come back and make some comments. Now Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Then Abraham rose from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner among you. Give me a burial site among you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying to him, Hear us, my lord, you are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our graves. None of us will refuse you his grave for burying your dead. So Abraham rose and bowed to the people of the land, the sons of Heth. And he spoke with them, saying, If it is your wish for me to bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and approach Ephron, the son of Zohar, for me, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns, which is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence for a burial site. Now Ephron was sitting among the sons of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the sons of Heth, even of all who went in at the gate of his city, saying, No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the presence of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead. And Abraham bowed before the people of the land. He spoke to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, saying, If you will only please listen to me, I will give the price of the field. Accept it for me, that I may bury my dead there. Then Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, My lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between me and you? So bury your dead. Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver which he had named in the hearing of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, commercial standard. So Ephron's field, which was in Machpelah, which faced Mamre, the field and cave which was in it, and all the trees which were in the field that were within all the confines of its border, were deeded over to Abraham for a possession in the presence of the sons of Heth, before all who went in at the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field at Machpelah, facing Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave that is in it were deeded over to Abraham for a burial site by the sons of Heth. Now, as you're listening to that being read, perhaps you're looking at it on your own as I'm reading along, you might notice that this sounds a little bit like legal jargon, doesn't it? I mean, there is some narrative telling us a little bit about what's going on with Abraham and the sons of Heth, the Hittites. There is some narrative there, but it really does sound like it's recording this like a legal document, so that anyone who reads this will know the truth of what happened there. And many people have pointed this out and recognized the similarity. And it's not unusual. This is an important moment. Abraham's been in the land, he's been living in the land, but he doesn't own any of the land. And now here he is going to, before the story is done here, at the end of this chapter, we find that he ends up owning a piece of land in this promised land. And so for that reason, this is a substantial and important story. And as we're concerned with the carrying forth of the promise that God is going to give Abraham a child, and then he's going to give him land, the land that I will show you, now we see that he's actually getting the land, at least a small piece of it at this point, which hints towards something more. Now, let's go back and take a look at this. We might mention, before we begin looking verse by verse, that the Hittites were a people that, until about 100 years ago, there was some question among scholars about whether such a people ever actually existed. We know that in the Bible they existed. We see the Hittites being referenced here, and then we also know that David's wife Bathsheba was originally married to a man named Uriah the Hittite. But about 100 years ago, there were some archaeological discoveries that documented the Hittite civilization. And so we know now that what the Bible says is true, that the Hittites really did live. It's always amazing whenever people have questions about something in the Bible, some group of people, some particular biblical character. In so many cases, if they just wait long enough, somebody turns over a rock over somewhere in the Near East, and we find that, oh, guess what? This people group actually did exist. It happened time and time again, and even in this story, in this series through the book of Genesis, we've seen that happening time and time again. Now, verse 1 tells us that Sarah lived 127 years. Now, there's some important things that we need to say about this. First of all, this is the only woman in the Bible whose age at death is recorded. And this just gives testimony to how important she was in the book of Genesis, and really as the grandmother, so to speak, of Israel, all of the whole rest of the story of the Bible. She has a very important role to play. And so this gives her honor. And we see here, of course, Abraham wanting to buy a plot of land. He doesn't just bury her just anywhere. He wants to bury her in the land that is the promised land, and he wants to give her a proper burial. And we can imagine that wealthy Abraham built her an impressive place to be entombed there. And she wouldn't be the only one in the family to ultimately be entombed there. But we also should say something about this number. She died at 127. Now, I take that number to be literal. I think that that is telling us when she died, the exact age she was when she died. And because I take it that way, you say, well, why wouldn't you take it that way? Well, I'll get to that in just a moment. But as a notation moving forward, this does help us with our timing of Isaac's life, because Sarah dies at 127, and she was 90 when Isaac was born. So at this point in the story, Isaac was about 37 years old. And so that is helpful for us in figuring out about how old Isaac was as we move forward here in just a little while, when Isaac gets a wife, when they go looking for a wife for Isaac. Why would someone not think that 127 was her literal age, but that something else was going on there? Well, the reason for that is because the Midrash sees some kind of symbolism here. That 100 stands for a great age, In other words, God's been good to you that you've lived to this great age. You're an impressive person. 20 stood for beauty, and 7 for blamelessness. So the number 127 ties everything together, that this is a great woman, this was a beautiful woman, this is a blameless woman. I don't know. Even if that is some sort of symbolic thing, God providentially could have ensured that she would die at an age where there's some interesting symbolism there, but also that's when she actually died. I don't want to read too much into it, though, because we don't know this for sure. All we know for sure is the Bible tells us that she died at 127. So we're going to take it that way. So Sarah dies, and then Abraham is put into a precarious situation. He must secure for her a place to be buried. Now, as I say, Abraham has been in the land, but he doesn't own any piece of the land. Now, it says to us that Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Now, we need to say something about this, because, most of this chapter doesn't really seem to give us a picture of Abraham showing all this emotion. It's just kind of mentioned here at the beginning. However, we need to develop that a little bit, because the phrasing here in verse 2 and 3 does give us a picture of Abraham that shows us that he was concerned for her. We've seen throughout Abraham's life that he was very concerned for his sons. It might not have been very obvious how much he cared for Sarah. I mean, especially considering the dealings with Abimelech, all that happened with Hagar, but we find some evidence here that, no, he loved Sarah too. Well, what is that evidence? Well, first of all, I think that the reason that we don't see the passage dwelling too much on Abraham's emotional state of affairs as it relates to Sarah is because, as we say, this is drawn up somewhat as a legal document. At least that's how it appears. But it says here that he came to mourn and to weep for her. Now, mourn means to bewail. And weep can cover weeping and joy, or weeping and sorrow. But it could be like a weeping of joy or a weeping of sorrow. But when it's followed by the accusative, as it is here, Wenham says that it always refers to sorrow because of death. And he says that the two terms together imply that Abraham was in the throes of the traditional mourning customs, such as rending his garments, disheveling his hair, cutting his beard, scattering dust on his head, and fasting. These rites were carried out in front of the corpse, which is why it says he came in, like into the part of the tent where Sarah is lying there, her corpse is lying there, and he rose up from before his dead wife. Right? So in these brief sentences, we do see a picture of a man who is bewailing and going through all of the traditional, tearing his garments, covering his head with dust, all these kind of things. This is a man who loved his wife. And we see here now that it's a picture of that in the way that this is phrased. Let's go back and continue here, though. Then, verse 3, Abraham rose from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner among you. Give me a burial site among you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying to him, Hear us, my lord. You are a mighty prince among us. Now notice, Abraham didn't say that about himself. They're saying that about him. Bury your dead in the choicest of graves. None of us will refuse you his grave for burying your dead. Now, before we go on too far, let me point out something from verse 4. In verse 4, Abraham says, I am a stranger and a sojourner among you. Give me a burial site. Now, this is mentioned in the New Testament. In the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, we see in chapter 11, verse 13 through 16, it says, All these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So we see the use of the phraseology here where the author of Hebrews is referencing that Abraham said about himself that he was a sojourner in the land, as verse 4 says, a stranger and a sojourner. But not only that, in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, this terminology is also employed, no doubt with full awareness of the story of Abraham, to the church as they live in a culture that is not the culture that represents the things of God. Just as Abraham was a sojourner in a land that would one day be his, or at least his people's, we see here in 1 Peter 2:11, Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims. Peter's referring to two separate cultures, the culture of the people around you and the culture, above, you might say, the things of God. So we see there some interesting New Testament data that kind of makes use of and provides light for what is said here in verse 4. The sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying to him, Hear us, my lord, you are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our graves. None of us will refuse you this grave for burying your dead. Now we see the back and forth here between Abraham and the Hittites, and particularly Ephron. I want you to notice here how cordial everyone is with each other, how congenial, how gracious they are with each other. And this is not a surprising thing. Not only do I want you to notice how congenial they were with each other, I want you to notice the public nature of the whole thing. The Bible makes it clear that this is done in the public eye. Everyone sees this. Now, we need to talk a little bit about what's going on here. Why are they so helpful to him? Why do they offer to let him bury Sarah in any of their graves, in their choicest graves? Why does Ephron ultimately say that he just will give Abraham? It's like Abraham wants to buy it, and Ephron is just saying, no, I'll just give it to you. Well, there are a couple of things we need to say about this. There are a couple of ways we can understand this. First of all, you need to understand that the honor and shame culture that exists in the New Testament Mediterranean world was not entirely absent from this location, this locale, and this period of time either. This was a collectivist society that was focused on honor and shame as a currency of the day. And this was the honorable thing. This was sort of like a custom, You can't outgive me. You're not going to outgive me. I'm going to outgive you. I want to do good things for you. It's like a way of being courteous and respectful and polite. It could well be that Ephron is just displaying the typical cultural courtesy. It could be that he wishes to maintain actual ownership, though. If a sale is not made, there could be an expiration date on the deal. You understand? If Ephron just gives the land to Abraham, one thing we do know about ancient civilizations is that if land is just given, even if it's said to be given, it can sometimes be something that is, after a certain period of years, the ownership goes back to the original person. We'll see something sort of like that in the Mosaic Law later on. It could be that if it's given to Abraham, then Abraham might not have final say over everything that happens on that land. There may be stipulations put on it. There may be stipulations where certain goods from the land can be taken, or who knows. And so for these reasons, perhaps Abraham isn't really happy with that sort of an arrangement. Or it could be that he's being completely genuine and wishes to give it to Abraham. We don't really know. But one possibility that many scholars seem to think is likely is that this was just a cultural courtesy, kind of a game of back and forth, like, hey, how much do you want for that land? I'll just give it to you. And that in reality, Ephron expected no such thing. Ephron maybe did want to be paid for this, but he wanted to seem charitable and honorable. But the little social game that everyone was aware of was that Abraham is not to take Ephron up on this. It would have, just like it would have been discourteous for Ephron not to make the offer of the free gift, it would likewise be discourteous and shameful for Abraham to take him up on the free gift. So this little game of back and forth may seem silly, but at the same time, it's necessary for both parties to remain honorable and polite. This, of course, still happens today, even in our culture. Think about it. Somebody tries to give you a gift and you say, oh, no, I couldn't do that. I couldn't take that from you. I could never do that. No, I really do want you to take this. No, I can't do that. Oh, how much would you want? How much do you like for it? How much do you want for it? All right, fine, $5. Okay, thank you. I'll give you $5. We play the same game as well, and that's kind of what we see happening here. So that's a live possibility. It's not entirely clear which way this is to be taken. We do know that we saw before that Abraham likes to have clearly defined business deals. We just saw in our last lecture, like with the ewe lambs and Abimelech. Even though Abimelech wasn't challenging what Abraham was saying about this well, Beersheba came to be known as Beersheba because of this very event. Even though Abimelech wasn't challenging that, Abraham wanted to do this deal and give him the ewe lambs to make sure that it's clear to everyone, henceforth, this is my well. In the same way, he doesn't want to take the deal from Ephron, and it may well be, he doesn't want to be given the land from Ephron. And it may well be because he wants a clean business transaction. He wants everyone around there to know, no, nobody gave me this. Nobody can take it back from me. Nothing's going on here like that. I paid for this. And so ultimately Ephron says, well, what's 400 shekels between men like you and me? And 400 shekels what's that between us? Obviously both wealthy men. This was a hefty sum. And it's still a customary statement in Damascus to this day to say this phrase, what's that between us, when a business transaction is done. That's my understanding, which may well go back all the way to this story. But we see here that Abraham is willing to pay whatever he has to pay to get this done. He wants to make sure that it's done, which indicates from this amount of money that this could well have been a sizable amount of land and sizable goods that needs to be taken into account. All right, another thing I want to point out is look down at verse 12 and you'll see, and Abraham bowed before the people of the land. Now, we need to talk about his posture here. And you'll notice that this also happens in verse 3. Then Abraham rose from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth. Now, the one thing we know about business deals at this period of time is the business deals were done sitting down. So when Abraham stands, it's a signal to everyone around that I have something serious that I want to say. It was a big deal to stand up in the midst of a business arrangement like this. And of course, it is a big deal, not only because Abraham loves Sarah, but because after all, time is of the essence. We got to do something with Sarah's body, and every day that goes by is a day that she's decaying and all that. So we've got to do something about this. And in all sincerity, Abraham stands. This would have been significant to the people. Also, I want you to notice down in verse 12, it says, now, well, first look at verse 11. In verse 11, Ephron says, "No, my Lord, hear me." Now, this is an idiom, we think, among the Hittites. Hear me, when they're about to say something. And then in verse 12, when Abraham bowed before the people of the land, he spoke to Ephron in the hearing of all the people, saying, "If you will only please listen to me." A little bit different, but same sort of thing. Ephron has said, "Hear me." Abraham says, "Listen to me." Now, this may not be all that interesting to you, but I think it is a bit interesting because what it appears is going on here is that what some commentators have said, that when Abraham says, "If you will only please listen to me," he is trying to kind of speak their own language. He's using an idiom that they previously used in verse 6 as well. "Hear us, my Lord." So what we see is Abraham doing everything he can to make sure this deal goes through cleanly. And we, businessmen today recognize that that's still a good thing to do. Do you know that when you're talking to people, there are certain people who do this naturally. Maybe you already do this. My wife notices that I kind of do this naturally without realizing I'm doing it. If I'm talking to someone and they talk a certain way, maybe they're talking at a certain rate of speed, or they use a certain turn of phrase, or whatever, I tend to, without realizing it, kind of absorb the way they're talking and kind of talk like they do. Not in a dishonest way. I don't even realize I'm doing it, but I just kind of tend to talk as they talk. And there are actually some books that are kind of books about, influencing people with your speech and being a good leader and business transactions and all these kind of things, where they say that's actually extremely helpful. If you can only identify with people's experiences so far. You can make up for that some bit by speaking as they speak. If you're talking to someone who talks a little quickly, you talk quickly. If they talk slow, you talk slow. If they have a certain posture of body language, you have that posture of body language. And it kind of lubricates the engagement and makes it more pleasant for everyone involved. Well, we see here Abraham is doing that as well. That's what some scholars seem to think. He's picking up on their own idioms and trying to use it. All of this to say, the point is, Abraham is trying to do everything that he can to facilitate a good deal here. And they're doing a good job too. They're doing a good job, being generous with him. We can't speculate too much about what their motivations are beyond what we've already said, but that is certainly happening. Let's see what we can say about this place of Machpelah. Machpelah. I'm going to read from Wenham here on page 128 of his commentary. This is Gordon Wenham from the Word Biblical Commentary of Genesis chapters 16 through 50. This is a good commentary for the most part. I don't agree with everything, but hey, what are you going to do? But Machpelah seems to be the name of the area in which the cave was located. But from the Septuagint, many hold that it describes the cave as a double cave, from the root of a word that means to fold or double. Long tradition going back to Josephus in the 1st century identifies the site of Machpelah with the area now covered by the large mosque of Haram al-Khalil in the town of Hebron, as remains of Herodian monastery are visible in the mosque. This corroborates Josephus' comments that the tomb of the patriarchs was located there in his time. So now we have a place for Sarah to be buried, and this pretty well sums up this chapter. You'll see the final verses, as I've already mentioned, seem to look like it's some sort of a very formal way of putting things to clarify this place. And, this would have been important later on to show that God not only was willing to fulfill what he said he would fulfill for Abraham, but we can see that he did it in a clear and undeniable way. And now we come to Genesis chapter 24. It says, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. Oh, wait a second. That's not Genesis 24. That's Matthew 22:2. I mention it here because Genesis chapter 24 is one of my favorite stories in the book of Genesis. Perhaps that's because I'm kind of a romantic about things like this. But I do think it's telling, and many other Christians have noticed, that Matthew 22:2 talks about something of which the story of Isaac and Rebekah may be a bit of a type. In Matthew 22:2 it says, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. In this passage we see someone who might as well be a king. He looked like a king to everybody else during his day, Abraham. As Abraham wants to send his servant out to find a bride for his son. And so in this antitype, it looks like Abraham is the picture of God the Father. Isaac is the picture of Jesus. We're used to that by now. And the servant that we're going to meet, who is unnamed, is like the Holy Spirit. And then, of course, Rebekah would be the church. And the servant even goes out to find Rebekah and gives her gifts, just like the Holy Spirit gives us gifts. And we are the bride of Christ. I only mention that here at the beginning because some people have seen that and noticed that as a possible type. You'll read about it, you'll hear about it in commentaries and things. And maybe telling you at the beginning of the story will allow you to notice things. Maybe you'll notice things that most others would miss if we mention it here at the beginning. Another little line of parallel before we get into the nuts and bolts of the story is that Rebekah does not know who it is. She doesn't know what he looks like. She's never seen visibly or heard audibly the voice of Isaac, her groom-to-be. Nevertheless, she's willing to go meet him, and she loves him in spite of not knowing him, we might imagine. And of course, in 1 Peter 1:8 it says, and though you have not seen him, you love him. And though you do not see him now, but believe in him, you greatly rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory. That is how the churches in Asia Minor felt about Jesus, according to Peter. And it's certainly true of Rebekah in this story. So let's go ahead and begin looking at the text and see what it says in this story of a bride for Isaac. Now Abraham was old, advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in every way. Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge over of all that he owned. Now, a couple of things to mention here. First of all, many have noted that this looks like a bit of an obituary entry for Abraham. Even though it's not the moment of Abraham's death quite yet, it's just reminding us of all the ways that God did bless Abraham like he said he would. In fact, it tells us he blessed him in every way. So that's important to mention there. And because we're about to see how that blessing that was poured out on Abraham is going to be carried forth in Isaac, since Isaac is going to carry the promise on that God made to Abraham. And then, of course, Jacob. And then we'll see it move on from there throughout biblical history. Nevertheless, Abraham was blessed in every way. Verse 2 said that Abraham got his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had owned. Now, remember, Eliezer had been previously mentioned as the servant of Abraham's household. Is this the same Eliezer? Perhaps, if Eliezer was in his 50s or an older, wasn't a young man back in, say, chapter 15, then at this point he may have been very, very old. So this may not be Eliezer. In fact, the Bible doesn't tell us who it is exactly. But if so, Eliezer was the rightful heir. He was going to get all the stuff from Abraham if there wasn't to be a child. So this could be seen as particularly benevolent of Eliezer, if this is Eliezer and what he does going forward. Now notice here that it says, please place your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live. But you will go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac. The servant said to him, suppose the woman is not willing to follow me to this land. Should I take your son back to the land from where you came? Then Abraham said, beware that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me and who swore to me, saying, to your descendants I will give this land, he will send his angel before you, and you will take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this my oath. Only do not take my son back there. So the servant placed his hand under the thigh of Abraham, his master, and swore to him concerning this matter. Now, what's going on? This is a very strange situation. Why is Abraham so emphatic? You don't take my son Isaac back there. I mean, if the whole deal is to get a bride for Isaac, I mean, what does the geography matter that much? Why can't, if she won't come here, I can take him there. I'll find a girl for Isaac, but isn't that what matters most, is that they meet? Well, not exactly. And then there's this second concern of what is this business with put your hand under my thigh? People, I think, are a bit squeamish about what the Bible is probably saying in some of these ancient moments like this. We have a tendency in the modern evangelical world with Christian bookstores and the like to try and whitewash everything and make it PG rated at most. And we don't ever like for anything that seems unpleasant by our modern day standards to be discussed. Nevertheless, I'm going to tell you something that you might feel weird about according to modern day customs. Whenever preachers talk about this, they'll use all kinds of strange analogies. I heard one man say that putting the hand under the thigh might have been something like an act of submission or something like that. But probably what is going on is that this person was supposed to put his hand on the genitals of the person he's making the oath with. And the reason for this is when you make an oath, you put your hand on something that is incredibly valuable. Even today in courtrooms, at least as of this recording, it may not last, you put your hand on the Bible in order to make an oath of some sort. And so in this day and age in which this story is taking place, you would put your hands on something valuable, like a man's genitals. The reason for that was that is the place from which life springs forth. That is in fact, here it's even contextually important because we're talking about lineage and what's going to happen. But we'll see this coming up again later. And I just want to point out that that might seem strange to us, but that's only because of our bizarre 21st century sensitivities. At least I don't think they're bizarre. I'm a 21st century man, but they would have seemed bizarre to people back then, just as their customs may seem bizarre to us today. Either way, this is probably what's happening here. Now, he makes him promise to go back to his own people to get this daughter, this wife for Isaac, and to bring her back here. And the servant is trying to cover all of his bases, trying to figure out exactly what do you want me to do? What if the woman doesn't want to follow me back to the land? Should I take your son there? Abraham is emphatic about this and even promises that an angel is going to go ahead and direct them. But the point is, you're not to take my son to go there. Now, one of the reasons for this is probably because Abraham doesn't want Isaac to ever go back to Mesopotamia because this would tempt Isaac. Now, it's not explicitly stated, but God has made this promise about this land, and Abraham to be carried forth, it's going to be carried forth through Isaac and his family lineage. And he doesn't want to die and have Isaac going back to this other land and being tempted by all the things that are there and just become comfortable there and stay there. He wants to see what God promised would happen as best he can take care of his end of the deal. And so that's probably what he's thinking. Don't take because it is emphatic. The translators of the New American Standard Bible even put an exclamation point, beware that you do not take my son back there. The point, and he reiterates it. The point is, don't do that. She's to come here. He's not to go there. That's very important. I don't know how Abraham is confident that he can promise that an angel will go before him, but we find out that is what happened. So let's go on with the story now and see what it says here in verse 10. Then the servant took 10 camels from the camels of his master and set out with a variety of good things of his master's in his hand. And he arose and went to Mesopotamia, the city of Nahor. He made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water at evening time, the time when women go out to draw water. This would usually be young virgins that are to go out. He said, O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today, and show loving kindness to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring, and the daughters of men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now may it be that the girl to whom I say, please let down your jar so that I may drink, and who answers, drink, and I will water your camels also. May she be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. And by this I will know that you have shown loving kindness to my master. Now, this distance that he traveled, not much is made about it. Just that he set out and he went to this city. This angel, no doubt, led the way. Now, what one might say, well, what does this tell us about angels? Well, it tells us that sometimes they can influence us even without being seen. There's no mention of an angel being seen here. And it's important to recognize that we do live in a world. Oftentimes people in modern Christians have a hard time believing in the angelic and the demonic, or at least they live their lives not recognizing that just below the surface of how we see the world around us, there is this spiritual reality, and these angels and demons are very real. As J.P. Moreland, the great Christian apologist, says, that angels and demons are system-dependent entities. That is, if you believe that Christianity is true, then you thereby must believe that angels and demons are real, because they're part of the Christian story, a part of the Christian message. And they do influence, it seems. I don't know how often, I don't know when, but it seems that they can, and without being seen. Now, this begs the question of God's providence and human freedom, and what is the interplay in all of that? Some of you have noticed that throughout this study, I have pointed out my belief that men have a type of freedom that is called libertarian freedom. Libertarian freedom means that you have the genuine ability to make a real choice between options. There is a systematic theology or a soteriological perspective known as Calvinism, and I have many wonderful Calvinist friends who I love and I hope enjoy this series and will not be upset with me for pointing out my own tendencies on this, but Calvinists, for the most part, are compatibilists, and a compatibilist is a soft determinist. And all of that is just fancy language for saying that on Calvinism, men do whatever they want, but their wants have been determined by a chain of cause and effect going back to God, such that what you want is what you were determined to want, and so what you do flows from those wants, such that we call what you're doing making choices, and you do make choices. You experience them as choices. You feel as though you're free in that sense. But every action comes from a want or desire that is determined for you by a causal chain going back to God. So that freedom of the will, as most people typically understand it, that I really am free to make a genuine, bona fide choice between two or more options, and it really is up to me in every sense. That on Calvinism, that's not exactly what's going on. You follow your nature. You do whatever your nature dictates that you will do. And so when you come to a story like this, where there is an angel that is influencing when and how this servant gets to the place he's going, and clearly at what time, if he's going to be there at the right time, that the first girl he meets is the right girl and all that sort of thing, and that she'll say what she's supposed to say, and that he asked that she would say the right thing, and that God granted all of this. Well, if all that's true, how in the world can man have the kind of libertarian freedom that I believe that man has, and that all non-Calvinists believe that man has? Well, we can say a couple of things about this. First of all, it's important to say that we do believe that we have influences. We believe we're free to make choices, but we do believe we have influences. I'm influenced by a lot of things. I'm influenced by my own ambitions. I'm influenced by what other people tell me. I'm influenced by my flesh. I may want a particular thing, but I'm also influenced by the Spirit. And so we do have influences. So there's no problem with the idea of an angel influencing the course of events, such that certain things, if everybody's being obedient, turn out as they're supposed to turn out. It's also important to note that the servant was riding atop a camel, and I don't know that animals have libertarian freedom. One of the things I mentioned way back on the lecture on Genesis chapter 1 about being made in the image of God is that I think that one thing that's different about us from the animals and a way that we're like God and not like the animals is that we have libertarian freedom, the ability to choose. I don't know that animals have that. They seem to be following their instincts and not much more than that. So I don't think they're making choices. And it could be that that camel was quite literally being directed by the angel such that the servant would end up where he should at the particular time. As for Rebekah saying what she was supposed to say at the right time, I don't know. It could be that God foreknew that and that he influenced the man to pray for that or influenced her to say that, or I don't know. The thing is, we don't really have a problem. Non-Calvinist believers do not have a problem with God doing things. We don't even have necessarily a problem with God overwhelming someone's will and determining that they say certain things or do certain things. The idea, the primary thing is we have a problem with the idea that God would determine sin and determine people to do sinful and wicked things. And of course, none of that is going on in this story, and so there's really no problem at all for someone who believes in libertarian freedom to see an angel influencing the events and God influencing the events. All right, so I don't know if you cared much for that excursion, but I gave it to you nonetheless. Verse 12. He said, "O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show loving kindness to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now may it be that the girl to whom I say, please let down your jars so that I may drink, and who answers, drink, and I will water your camels also. May she be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. And by this I will know that you have shown loving kindness to my master." Before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor, came out with her jar on her shoulder. The girl was very beautiful, a virgin, and no man had relations with her. And she went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, "Please let me drink a little water from your jar." She said, "Drink, my lord." And she quickly lowered her jar to her hand and gave him a drink. Now when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I will draw also for your camels until they have finished drinking." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran back to the well to draw. And she drew for all his camels. Meanwhile, the man was gazing at her in silence to know whether the Lord had made his journey successful or not. Now we need to say something about the idea of Rebekah being the one for Isaac. Many times Christian young people really struggle with the idea, and I shouldn't just say young people, older people too, struggle with the idea of whether there is one person out there that God has for them. I remember when I was a teenager, I often wondered about this and was looking for the girl. Fortunately, I think my parents did a good enough job raising me that I didn't worry too much about whether or not I never dated much just for pleasure. I always dated with the goal of finding someone to marry. And if a girl was not the one I was supposed to marry, well, then I didn't continue dating her. In fact, I even had one girl that I had convinced of that, who I was dating, who said to me, I actually think that I think we need to break up because, and this was the strangest thing to me. She said, "I think we need to break up because I think you're the one that I'm supposed to marry. And since you're the one that I'm supposed to marry, and I'm not ready to marry, and I'm not ready to find the person I'm supposed to marry, I want to have fun dating for a while. So I'm going to go off and do that, and then ultimately I'll come back to you, and ultimately we'll get married." And I thought, that is the strangest thing in the world. I didn't quite know what to think about it. Is she the one? Is she not the one? Who knows? Very, very strange circumstances. But I was always looking for that one that I was supposed to marry. And passages like this do kind of give you that idea. Of course, in the New Testament, it makes it a little less clear. You hear that, widows and they can marry or not marry. It's kind of up to them, and all these kind of things. It's a strange deal. I personally think that if you follow God's will for your life as best you can, if you try to do what God wants, and you're trying to do things the way He would have you to do them and to make the right decisions, I do think that the steps of a righteous man are ordered of the Lord, and so for that reason, I think He'll lead you the right way. Of course, you have no guarantee that she is being righteous, and that, or if you're a woman, that he is being righteous, the person that you hope to will be the one. So I think back on people that I dated and this whole situation, and I think about moments where I was so convinced that a particular girl was the girl that I was supposed to marry, and then either she messed it up or I didn't hear God clearly enough or whatever it was, and we didn't end up getting married. And I've really just come to the conclusion at this point in my life that while it may be the case, I'm not even certain about this, that there is a person that, all things being equal, is the person that would best suit you, and that God is aware of that, and that if you and she are both trying to serve God faithfully, it's reasonable to conclude that he would lead you toward each other. There are so many variables at play that I think it likely that there are, hopefully in a good Christian community, there are a number of godly women and a number of godly men, and that it's perfectly reasonable and perfectly fine to talk with these people and find out where they are with the Lord. And if you feel that one of these people is living for the Lord and has similar goals, and seems like their ministry that God has given them somewhat complements the ministry that he's given you, and it looks like it would be a good setup, that you shouldn't be waiting for some kind of spiritual voodoo to kind of fall out of the sky and tell you that this is the right thing. You should trust that God is at work and make that decision based on, what's going on internally and in terms of your attraction and all those sorts of things. In fact, attraction is an important thing. It mentions here, and we should say, it mentions here in this passage that this girl was very beautiful. In verse 16, it says this. And, that's an important feature, that you're attracted to the person that you end up married to. Some people downplay that. Our world today wants everyone to be perfectly fine with whatever they look like, and I understand that. But that being true, it's still important that there is some level of attraction between two people who are supposed to be in love. You say, well, yeah, but it's about it's what's inside that counts. Yes, it is. That does count too. But physical attraction counts for something. And oftentimes it's physical attraction that demonstrates first and foremost that someone might be a potential candidate for a romance. Even in this story where the servant is looking for a bride and he's not personally going to be the one to marry Rebekah, first thing that crosses his mind, at least in terms of what we're given here, is that the girl is very beautiful. And if she's going to be Sarah's daughter-in-law, think about that. Think about the legacy of a beautiful woman that she's got to now live up to. She doesn't have to live up to it, but it's certainly fitting in this family where it's been said about Sarah's beauty, how beautiful she was. And so beauty is an important thing. When I first met my wife, I don't believe in love at first sight. And perhaps I've mentioned this before in this series, but I don't believe in love at first sight. We have a term for that that's called lust. And I looked across the student center where we were, and I saw Sarah Waller, who would become Sarah Hunter, and I thought she is gorgeous. That is to say, just as this man, the girl was very beautiful, like verse 16 says. And I wanted to go talk to her. I wanted to spend time with her. And so my first impulse was one of physical appeal. And that's not an uncommon thing. So that needs to be a part of it. And following some of these impulses, provided that a person is the person that God, a godly woman that God might allow for you to marry, or a godly man that God might allow for you to marry, is perfectly fine. This business about one person out there for someone, I think, sidetracks a lot of people. And I even know of one person that I am close with, who's a close friend of the family, a woman who really struggles over this. She's had a couple of failed marriages. Neither of those ultimately were her fault. Both of them had to do with marital infidelity on her husband's parts. And she feels like she just, whoever it was that God had for her is long gone, and she messed it up by making the wrong choice. And, I don't know that she needs to marry again. That's really none of my business. But the bottom line is, I think this worry about one person out there has stood in the way and taken a lot of joy away from people like her. And so I just think that young people need to follow God's leadership as best they can, and then find someone who seems like someone who's going to be a help to them in ministry and in service, and that they can be a help to that person and someone that they fall in love with. And, there you go. Trust that God will guide you. And then whoever you marry, my mother used to tell me this, and I think it's a perfectly acceptable and theologically correct way of looking at it. Whether or not the person you marry is the one that God had for you, they become the one that God has for you, present tense, by virtue of the fact that you married them. And so that's a very important thing to keep in mind as you go forward with this. Now, it says that she was very beautiful. Now, we would imagine that the servant could see that just from looking at her, right? He could see that she's beautiful. But a virgin, and no man had relations with her, and she went down to the spring and filled it up. How would he know that she was a virgin just by looking at her? Well, it could be, and this will show up again in the story, it could be that he is aware of this, that the scripture is just giving us details that we will find out later, but that the servant at this moment doesn't yet know. I mean, he knows she's beautiful, but he doesn't necessarily know that she's a virgin. Although it's possible, some commentators will point out that it's possible that something to do with her attire, how she was dressed, would have tipped him off about that. It could be that it's typically the case that the young virgins would be the ones to go get the water. That could have tipped him off to that. But it could be also that it's giving us details that we don't know yet. All right. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, "Please let me drink a little water from your jar." She said, "Drink, my lord." And she quickly lowered her jar to her hand and gave him a drink. Now, we saw this a moment ago. Let's think about this for a moment here, though. This is a very clear fleece that's being sent out, so to speak. I mean, this is a very clear sign. It may not seem that way to you, but think about this. The servant's got 10 camels. Now, my understanding is that camels can drink anywhere between 25 and 30 gallons of water at once. So when she's saying that she's going to water his camels too, she could be getting 250 gallons of water for these camels. Now think about that. Now, if she had a 10-gallon jar, which that's pretty heavy. I don't know if she had a 10-gallon jar, but if she had a 10-gallon jar, then she'd have to do this 25 times. I mean, this is a major sacrifice of her time and energy and would have taken a while. And now it says that the man was gazing at her in silence to know whether the Lord had made his journey successful or not. Like, how much does it take to convince you, man? Like, is she on her last trip to water the last camel and he's standing there thinking, I'm not so sure yet, what's exactly going on. But verse 22 says, when the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold ring weighing a half shekel and 2 bracelets for her wrists weighing 10 shekels in gold and said, whose daughter are you? Please tell me, is there room for us to lodge in your father's house? She said to him, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. Again, she said to him, we have plenty of both straw and feed and room to lodge in. Then the man bowed low and worshipped the Lord. He said, blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his loving kindness and his truth toward my master. As for me, the Lord has guided me in the way to the house of my master's brother. Then the girl ran and told her mother's household about these things. Now Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. And Laban ran outside to the man at the spring. And you're gonna notice as we go through this that when it comes to the time of the dealing with the family over this, trying to convince and persuade them, that Laban is going to take a chief role here, which may indicate that the father was getting old. I don't know. But it says in verse 30, when he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's wrists, and when he heard the words of Rebekah, his sister, saying, this is what the man said to me. He went to the man, and behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring. And he said, come in, blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside, since I prepared the house and a place for the camels? Now, the bracelets and this sort of thing would have tipped off the family, by the way, that whoever this is has got some money. At the very least, he's doing some nice things, and he's giving some costly things to this girl. What's exactly going on here? It looks like there's money involved. It looks like there's precious gifts. Maybe we ought to pay some close attention to this guy. So the man entered the house. Then Laban unloaded the camels, and he gave straw and feed to the camels and water to wash his feet and the feet of the men who were with him. But when food was set before him to eat, he said, I will not eat until I have told my business. And he said, speak on. So he said, I am Abraham's servant. Now they would have known something about Abraham. They might not have known exactly what the current status of Abraham's wealth was or necessarily of his family situation, but they would have known who Abraham was. And this man is now saying, I'm Abraham's servant. And I want you to notice as we move through, starting with verse 35, how it is that this man begins to slowly unfold the reasons that he's here in a way that would be enticing to those listening, certainly financially enticing. This is a tool of persuasion here. Verse 35 says, the Lord has greatly blessed my master so that he's become rich. Okay, so now we haven't told you exactly why we're here yet, but just so you know, my master is rich, right? And he has given him flocks and herds and silver and gold and servants and maids and camels and donkeys. Now Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master in her old age, and he has given him all that he has. Okay, so now he's unfolding a little bit more. My master is rich, and there's one heir apparent here, and that heir apparent, his son, is going to get everything. Verse 37, my master made me swear, saying, you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, in whose land I live. But you shall go to my father's house and to my relatives, and take a wife for my son. I said to my master, suppose the woman does not follow me. He said to me, the Lord before whom I have walked will send his angel with you to make your journey successful, and you will take a wife for my son from my relatives and from my father's house. Then you will be free from my oath when you come to my relatives, and if they do not give her to you, you'll be free from my oath. Okay, so now he's laid out, number one, there's financial benefit to you here. Number two, this is not a weirdo, this is a relative. And then number three, it seems like God's all over this thing. And he's going to get into more detail about that later on. But it seems like God's all over this thing, so I don't see any reason why you would turn this away. It seems to be the indication that we're being given here. And so he's laying all of this out. By the way, when we come to the specificity of Rebekah, I should add one thing to what I said before about my little sermonizing about is there one person for everyone? It may well have been that there was one person for Isaac because the carrying forth of the promise was so specifically crucial. And among his own family who were in a different place, there were probably limited young women. This may have been the only young woman that was appropriate. Now, from here to about verse 48 and including verse 48, the servant is just kind of retelling what's already happened. We don't really need to go over that material again. It would just be repetitive. But in verse 49, it says, so now, if you are going to deal kindly and truly with my master, tell me, and if not, let me know that I may turn to the right hand or the left. Then Laban and Bethuel replied, the matter comes from the Lord, so we cannot speak to you bad or good. Here is Rebekah before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. And when Abraham's servant heard their words, he bowed himself to the ground before the Lord. The servant brought out articles of silver and articles of gold and garments and gave them to Rebekah. He also gave precious things to her brother and to her mother. Then he and the men who were with him ate and drank and spent the night. When they arose in the morning, he said, send me away to my master. But her brother and her mother said, let the girl stay with us a few days, say 10. Afterwards she may go. He said to them, do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master. And they said, we will call the girl and consult her wishes. Then they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. Thus they sent away their sister Rebekah and her nurse with Abraham's servants and his men. They blessed Rebekah and said to her, may you, our sister, become thousands of 10,000s. May you, our sister, become thousands of 10,000s, and may your descendants possess the gates of those who hate them. Then Rebekah arose with her maids, and they mounted the camels and followed the man. So the servant took Rebekah and departed. Now, a couple of things to notice about this. It's interesting here that the woman is given a choice. Women had some measure of freedom, apparently, about certain things. At least when she would go, she had some choice. It wasn't as though women were just complete chattel. They had the freedom of choice, even though they didn't have the rights like women today in the Western world have. but they did have some choice about this. So that's an interesting thing to point out, especially since people often look at the Bible as playing into misogyny and things like that. Then you see here, it says, may you, our sister, become thousands of tens of thousands, speaking about her children. It says, and may your descendants possess the gate of those who hate them, meaning that they would be able to resist or overtake those who are their enemies. And, of course, that's very important considering who her descendants would be, as Jacob would then marry Rachel and Leah and have the 12 tribes of Israel, the children for whom the 12 tribes of Israel are named, right? So this is very interesting. And so they departed. And then it says in verse 62, now Isaac had come from going to Beer-lahai-roi, for he was living, and we talked about Beer-lahai-roi in a previous lecture, for he was living in the Negev. Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold. Now, when you're listening to this, in your mind's eye, watch the end of a romance movie, a romance between two people who've never met each other. And it's like there's a sunset. She's coming in on a camel with the servant, and Isaac is rising in the field from his meditation there. And here's the ending of the movie. We're about to see the credits roll. And it says, Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel. She said to the servant, who is that man walking in the field to meet us? And the servant said, he is my master. Then she took her veil and covered herself. That would have been the typical betrothal head covering situation. The servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into his mother, Sarah's tent, and he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. Thus Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So this bride for Isaac, this marriage, by the way, probably would have consisted of just a few simple words. We know by the time of the first century in Israel, there was a lengthy wedding ceremony that went on for several days. But at this point, it was very simple from some archaeological discoveries in the Mesopotamian Valley. According to Steve Gregg, through his research, he says that it's been documented that these ceremonies were something like, you are my wife, well, you are my husband, and then they were married. But don't let that take away from the importance of it, because a marriage covenant is a major deal. It is a major deal today, and it was a major binding deal in those days. And so there you have it. That's the end of the little story about a bride for Isaac. It's one of my favorite stories in the book of Genesis. I hope that you've enjoyed it as well.